The case of Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump and Consolidated Challenges, scheduled for oral argument before the U.S. Supreme Court on November 5, 2025, represents a landmark constitutional contest over the limits of presidential power in economic policy. At its core, the dispute asks whether the president has the authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, of 1977, to unilaterally impose massive, sweeping tariffs by declaring a national emergency. The current tariffs, which include duties imposed against Canada, Mexico, and China concerning the flow of fentanyl, as well as a broader minimum 10% reciprocal global tariff aimed at addressing the U.S. trade deficit, were enacted after the president declared multiple national emergencies. These tariffs have been successfully challenged by importers, such as Learning Resources, and a coalition of states in lower federal courts, including the U.S. Court of International Trade and the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Both lower courts ruled that the tariffs were contrary to law, asserting that IEEPA, which grants the president authority to regulate economic transactions during an emergency, does not implicitly grant the power to impose tariffs, a power explicitly reserved for Congress under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which states, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises." The analysis centers on the separation of powers. Critics argue that IEEPA was intended to curb presidential overreach by providing limited, specific emergency economic tools, typically used for sanctions and asset freezes. No prior president in the statute's nearly 50-year history had interpreted IE to grant blanket tariff authority. The lower court majorities and opponents of the tariffs invoke the major questions doctrine, which requires Congress to speak clearly when delegating issues of vast economic and political significance. They contend that the imposition of tariffs of this magnitude, which have remade the U.S. economy and foreign relations, requires express congressional authorization, not an inferred power from the general term regulate. The primary arguments presented to the Supreme Court are starkly opposed. The government argues that the text of IEEPA, particularly the word regulate, is broad enough to encompass tariffs, and that the president, as the nation's chief representative in foreign affairs, deserves judicial deference when declaring an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security or the economy. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has repeatedly defended the tariffs, asserting they are a necessary tool for national security and trade negotiation, even suggesting that the administration is prepared to pivot to other statutory authorities if the Supreme Court strikes down the IEEPA action. The consequences of this case, regardless of the ruling, are immense. If upheld, the tariffs remain the status quo, preserving hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue for the government. However, importers and consumers will continue to face average effective tariff rates near 18%, the highest since 1934. This prolonged cost burden risks exacerbating inflation and continuing to disrupt global supply chains. If struck down, the government faces the immediate liability of having to refund an estimated $100 billion or more in duties already collected. This massive budgetary hit could cause significant turmoil in the Treasury market and create financial instability for the federal government. Furthermore, companies that have preserved their right to refund must now actively track liquidation dates and file protests. Constitutionally, if upheld, the ruling would significantly expand the scope of executive power, establishing a precedent that allows the president to unilaterally levy taxes and regulate vast portions of the economy merely by declaring a national emergency, effectively bypassing Congress's core fiscal and trade role. If struck down, it reinforces the constitutional separation of powers, reining in the executive branch and placing the responsibility for such massive economic policy back in the hands of the legislative branch as originally intended. Given the Supreme Court's current composition, which has often favored executive power in recent years, especially concerning national security, a definitive ruling is difficult to predict. However, the application of the major questions doctrine and the clear constitutional assignment of the taxing power to Congress suggests that the administration's broad interpretation of IEEPA is on shaky legal ground. A likely scenario is a split decision. The court may strike down the sweeping, economy-wide reciprocal tariffs related to the general trade deficit. As this is an ordinary and commonplace issue, not an unusual and extraordinary threat, justifying such a vast use of emergency power, while potentially upholding the more narrowly tailored fentanyl-related tariffs against specific countries, arguing they more closely resemble traditional sanctions used under IEEPA. The broadest tariffs are highly vulnerable to the doctrine. Regardless of the judicial outcome, solutions must be pursued by all branches. For importers, companies must immediately maintain meticulous records for all entries and duties paid, as many entries are approaching the 314-day liquidation deadline. They must be prepared to file formal protests to secure refunds if the tariffs are ultimately invalidated. For the executive branch, as Bessent suggested, the administration must use Congress-approved statutory authorities, such as Section 232 or Section 301 of the Tariff Act of 1930, for future tariff actions, rather than attempting to justify broad economic taxation under an emergency power statute. For Congress, to eliminate future ambiguity and prevent this constitutional crisis from recurring, Congress needs to clarify the II statute by explicitly stating whether or not regulate includes the authority to impose tariffs, thereby resolving the long-standing delegation issue. This case forces the Supreme Court to choose between granting deference to the executive in times of perceived crisis and upholding the fundamental checks and balances that define the American system of governance.